has been going on during our breaks, and then just to listen to the chatter this evening. It's wonderful. It's exactly what we have been hoping for during this summit. Opportunities for state team colleagues to spend time talking when you don't usually get a chance to spend time together when you're back at work, and to make new connections with colleagues from other states. So, job well done for today. We have a real treat this evening. And I'd like to introduce Brian Touchette. Brian is going to introduce our speaker. Brian is a member of the ACES Steering Committee, and he is also the director of the Deaf Blind Project in the state of Delaware. So Brian, thank you.
I have the privilege of introducing Bhattacharyya. The interpreters assured me they were going to spell it correctly if I mispronounced it. Bapin was born in a village 20 miles south of Calcutta. I'm going to give you a little bit of history, but I'm going to skip most of the middle part because my understanding is he's going to be covering that as part of his presentation with us tonight. He was born deaf and will share with you how he acquired his blindness. Not surprisingly, he and his family had great difficulty finding a school that was willing to accept him in India. After much searching, he and his father journeyed halfway across the globe to begin school at the Perkins Institute in September of 1983. I have about a page here of his accomplishments and his life achievements. I'm going to skip that and fast forward 16 years to 1999. Where he began working as a technology development and training specialist at the Helen Keller National Center. It's very interesting with the work that I do in Delaware. I've had a chance to go across the state and work with many of the deafblind students, or students who are deafblind across the state. After hearing Rachel Quenneman earlier today talk about setting goals high for students and seeing all of the life accomplishments, it's really remarkable to remember that we do need to do that. And so it's with my pleasure that I get to introduce Bapin, and that he will be speaking about how we can better prepare students with deafblindness and other disabilities to use technology and open doors to their future.
Good evening, everyone. I want to thank Brian for that kind of introduction. And I want to thank you all for inviting me to come and speak with you tonight. I had a few thoughts while I was on the plane. I just arrived yesterday, and I'm not quite prepared for the cold. But the warmth from your hearts makes a difference. I shouldn't complain. I lived so many years in Massachusetts and then in New York. So I've been spoiled by my time in California, that's for sure. This evening, my topic is on how to empower students students through technology and how the power of technology leads to success in both education and employment. You may be wondering how a deafblind person can be successful as students and then further on in life, and how it can be that someone can lose both of those senses. So perhaps hearing my story will inspire you. This slide you can see up here shows an image of where I was born. As Brian said, it's a little bit south of Calcutta, in West Bengal, India. I lived in the village of Talari. I think you can see from this picture here that the living conditions were quite primitive. A very poor area with 80-85% undereducation or no education. My parents were teachers of high school. They are both hearing and sighted, and so when I was born deaf, they did not quite know what to do with me. But they knew that education was key for any future success. So they sent me to the elementary school near our home. There were no interpreters at that time, and I learned solely through an oral method. And my native language is Bengali, and so I learned how to lip read Bengali. I would sit in the front of the classroom so that I could see the teacher's mouth. And it was quite frustrating, as you might imagine, because teachers often turn around to write on a blackboard, in the mouth inaccessible. And I would have to remind them to stay turned towards me when they were speaking. My mother worked in the high school that was next to the elementary school. And so she was an advocate for me as well in the educational system. And I remember one teacher who had a beard and a mustache whose mouth was just impossible to see. And I would have to ask for repetition, or for him to shave his mustache a little bit. So that was my early education for first and second grade. And as I said, my parents were very involved in my education as advocates and tutors. So I had a lot of homework and time with my parents drilling me on what I needed to know. And I learned to read and write, to speak and lip read in Bengali. So I believe that, as we all know, the strong foundation of a first language is necessary for continued success. I played soccer, and I was the only deaf boy on my team. I was sighted at that point still, and I used my eyes to attend to the game. And of course, I was a target for the team as the only deaf boy. And one day, another boy approached me. He was upset because he had not been picked to be on the team. And we had an altercation. And and he threw ashes from the ground. So if you can imagine back then, it's a wood that had burned down, and threw ashes into my face, which caused my retina to detach. And my vision deteriorated from there. The doctors were unable to save my sight. They were unable to save the retinas. Just reading my notes. So I left school at that point, and I was home for 4 years while my parents searched for other educational opportunities for me. And there are deaf schools in India, and there are blind schools in India, but there are no educational opportunities at that time for deaf blind students. But my father refused to give up and continued the search. He eventually met the principal of the school, a blind institution, who recommended to him the name of the Perkins Institute, which is in Watertown, Massachusetts. My father was thrilled to have some information, so he contacted the Perkins School, sent a letter requesting that I be admitted. You may or may not know this, but costs of living in India are much less than they are here. So my father, in the letter asking for admission, also was asking for scholarship support, because there was no way they would have been able to pay that kind of tuition. And a letter came from the Perkins Institute accepting me as a student. So my father and I came to the United States. I knew no English at this time. I spoke Bengali. So that meant my father had to come with me to interpret from English into Bengali for me. So when I came, I had to learn 3 things at the same time. I had to learn English, along with the English, I also had to learn sign language, and I had to learn Braille, all at the same time. And I loved to read when I was a child. But after I became blind, I was very disappointed that I couldn't read, and I spent 4 years not reading. So I was very motivated to learn Braille so that I could start reading again. And I trained at it every day. And I would, learn English words and learn their Braille characters. And about a year, I had enough of the foundational language in English to read and write at an acceptable level. I planned to stay at Perkins only for 1 year, but they recognized that I had made such growth in that year that they encouraged me to stay on and to go all the way through graduation. My father agreed with that plan, and so he went back to India and I stayed and went through the program and got my high school degree. And then I went to Belmont Hall, which is a prep school, a private prep school. I wanted the experience of being around other people in a quote-unquote typically developed children environment. I maxed out basically on my educational opportunities at Perkins, and so then I went to Belmont Hall for more challenges in my educational aptitudes. And then I graduated, and I was looking to enroll in college. I went to Gardner-Webb University for 1 year. And a lot of professors had a difficult time accommodating my needs and understanding what my needs were. We had to send the materials out to be brailled, and that took extra time, so I didn't always have the benefit of the amount of time the other students had to do the work. I wanted desperately to be playing on a level playing field as the other students, but there were many barriers to that because of the translation process, because of getting textbooks scanned and then brailled. At that time, they'd say them on a disc so that I could read them. So there were many technology challenges. I had a 2.5 GPA after the end of that year, which I was not satisfied with. So I decided I would transfer to another university. And I went to the University of Arkansas in Little Rock. That was in 1993. And my GPA that first semester went from a 2.5 to a 4.0. Because the professors were very cooperative, very understanding of what sorts of things were needed, what kind of supports were needed, extended time, and so forth, and it made a big difference. So I think that's an important story to share with you when you're talking to the students with disabilities that you serve. I wanted to look at the evolution of technology, because even in my lifetime, I've seen a change. Starting with slate and chalk, which I use in elementary school in India, to using paper and pen, which I use later on. When I came to Perkins, having the access to computers, which were very, very new at that time, 1983. There's something called the Perkins Brailler and typewriters that we used when we were at Perkins. So if I wanted to type an essay and I had made an error, you'd have to take the paper out, start all over, so you may remember the old typewriter days. And nowadays, of course, we have these great advances in technology, computers and so forth. Back then, we certainly didn't have that. whiteout at one point was a great solution. And unfortunately, sometimes ripping out the entire paper was necessary. And that took a lot of effort and energy. After a year at the Perkins School, I realized that I had a special desire in me for technology. And growing up in village life, I wouldn't have discovered that particular passion because we didn't even have electricity. We didn't have running water. We didn't have anything but dirt roads. If you had lived 80 years ago, if you imagine that life in a village in India is, 25 or 40 years behind what it is here, it was quite a revelation to come here and realize that actually I love technology. And that was my first exposure to an early Apple product, the Apple IIe in 1988. I got hooked on some of the games that you could play. And they were learning games, so by playing the game, you would learn vocabulary and trivia. Of course, it weighed about 20 pounds, and you couldn't save all of your information. Then we had something called VersaBraille, also a cumbersome machine.